let's get this out of the way now. Saturday really, really sucked. You talk about the all-time stomach punch losses in Texas football, at least over the last 40 years. You had the 84 Cotton Bowl against Georgia, the 2001 Big 12 championship game against Colorado, the 2008 Tech game, the Alabama national title game, and you add Saturday's game against Oklahoma to the mix. And those other games were either back and forth games or games where Texas trailed and then fought back and then ended up losing. So I think there's an argument to be made that the Oklahoma game is the most embarrassing loss for Texas football in a really, really long time that's at least not to Kansas. But here's the thing. The Oklahoma game was also one of the two least important games on your schedule. The other one, ironically, is Arkansas, which you also lost, and I'd say that one's the only one that might be less important than Oklahoma, because that wasn't a conference game. But you can't lose to Louisiana, who, even though they're a really, really good team, they're still in the group of five, and it was still Sark's first game. You can't lose to Rice, because it's Rice, and then you can't lose conference games against the other teams in the conference, which I'll get to in a minute. And you can say, well, what about recruiting? Would you lose a recruiting edge against Oklahoma because of what happened? And I would say probably not. The Athletic did an article last year where they surveyed anonymous recruiting staffers around college football, and an SEC staffer, when asked what the biggest misconception about recruiting was, said that wins and losses matter to recruits. He said they don't. This recruiter told them that players would call them after losses and say that had that player been there, they would have won the game. It's kind of the mindset of a young person. They tend to be a little arrogant. I think we can all understand. We've all been 17, 18 years old in the past. Oklahoma and Texas A&M are certainly your two biggest recruiting threats, but Georgia's going to come into Texas, and Alabama and LSU and Ohio State. Everybody wants Texas players because there's so many of them, and there's so many of them that are very good. Losing one recruiting battle against Oklahoma is not going to make or break your class. Texas already has a good class lined up for next year. They're in good shape with a couple of other blue chip prospects. This game's not going to affect recruiting for Texas right now. You lose to Oklahoma 4 or 5 years in a row under Sark, maybe that's another story. But for now, it's really not going to have that big of an effect. So why do I say that this game wasn't that important to you? And that's because right now, Oklahoma exists in a tier by themselves in the Big 12. The Big 12 is currently in 4 tiers. Oklahoma's at the top. Texas Tech is in a 3rd tier just off of that second one, and then Kansas is in Kansas land. Everyone else in the Big 12, including Texas, is in what I call the midfield because I watch Drive to Survive and I'm not original. Here's Texas's record since 2010 against the rest of the teams in the Big 12 that aren't Oklahoma, Kansas, or Texas Tech. Baylor, 6-5. Iowa State, 7-4 but 3-3 in the last 6. Kansas State, 6-5. Oklahoma State, 4-7. TCU, 3-7, and that does include this year's game. And then West Virginia, 5-4. Charlie Strong beat Oklahoma. Tom Herman beat Oklahoma. Mack Brown beat Oklahoma at the end of his tenure. But those last 2 coaches that you had could not beat the other teams in your conference, and that kept you from building any kind of momentum at any point under those coaches. You have to beat those teams to get where you want to go. Yes, I know. We want Texas to go to the playoff. We want Texas to win national championships. We're Texas, blah, 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 blah. But the reality is, there is a pretty wide gap between where you are now and where you want to go. And to narrow that gap, you have to start beating these teams on your schedule. The Oklahoma game was miserable, but Oklahoma State's more important. They're a good team, we think. We don't really know a whole lot about Oklahoma State because they haven't really been challenged a ton themselves, and they're coming to Austin. Everything that you want to achieve this year is still right there in front of you. A national championship, a playoff appearance, none of that stuff was realistic where Texas was. You weren't going to close that gap in year 1. But the Big 12 championship game is an attainable goal. You still control your destiny when it comes to that, and it starts on Saturday when you play Oklahoma State at home. You win that game, you win the next one, you start building momentum, and then suddenly you find yourself in the Big 12 championship game at the end of the season. And who might you see? Oklahoma.